Welcome to Mex Moves, the weekly podcast where Damian Fraser and I, Eduardo Garcia, break down the topics and headlines shaping Mexico's business and financial landscape. How are you, Damian?
Very well, Eduardo. Thank you.
Great. This week we have an interesting interview with Guillermo Zamarripa, who is in charge or is the president of Mexico's Private Pension Fund Association, better known as Amafore. We discussed with him the status of the country's pension system, which was grown quite interestingly over the past decades, and talk about those who administer retirement plans for most Mexicans. In addition to that, Damian and I will review Fibra Monterrey's follow-on, BBVA breakdown of its business after the company's investment day in Madrid, Forbes Billionaire list, which even when there are other rankings, even in real time, some of them, is always a reference and generates quite a lot of interest. And a little bit more on foreign money going into Mexico's football. So, Damian, shall we start with Fibra Monterrey?
Sure. So Fibra Monterrey, as many of you would have seen, they priced a follow-on equity offering. I think it was about $490 million. So it was pretty well demanded. I think it was about 2 times oversubscribed, and about a quarter went to international investors and 3/4 to local investors, mainly Afore, the pension funds that Guillermo, who we're going to hear from shortly, represents. And it was, considering the market, which has been very weak, I think the underwriters, the company above all, will be pretty happy with the result. Why were they able to do this? I mean, first of all, what is Fibra Monterrey? I mean, Fibra Monterrey, as the name suggests, is based in Monterrey. It's an industrial REIT, or Fibra as they're called here, and it's mainly based in the north of Mexico. Headquarters are in Monterrey, of course. I think it has about 22 million square feet of leasable area. It also has industrial parks in the Bahia region in the center of Mexico, and their tenants are automobile, consumer durables, capital goods. Most of the revenues are in dollars, and they have, they're considered at least to have, first in class by Mexican standards corporate governance. They're internally managed. They don't pay fees to a related party as some of the other Fibras do. I think it probably did well because, first of all, the valuation is attractive versus the industrial leader, which is Prologis. I think that the cap rate was a bit over 7%, 7.4%. Prologis is nearer 6%. So you're capturing a decent sort of valuation gap versus the leader. I think that Prologis has been consolidating the sector. Of course, they bought Terrafina a year or so ago. Now they're in agreed talks or agreed merger with Fibra Macquarie. Still hasn't gone through all the different legal mechanisms, but it's very likely to happen. So they're becoming very big. Therefore, as they buy others, there are less options, and Fibra Monterrey becomes one of those options. I think I heard from someone involved that, and it might have been a little bit of PR and marketing, that the Iran conflict might benefit Mexico. The argument there is that, when there's a war in the Middle East and Iran is sort of the main oil supplier to China, you want to keep your nearshoring near, and there's nowhere nearer than Mexico, and you want to be even more kind of reluctant to invest heavily in China, which is very dependent on Iran, and may, if this conflict escalates further, may become in the ire of Trump yet again. So the sense is that America will kind of focus in on North America, which is obviously Mexico, Canada, and the US. So I think those were some of the reasons, and it's pretty defensive. It's a REIT. It pays out this dividend, 7% or so. The rents are medium to long-term contracts. They're all in dollars. So also, if you're looking for something defensive in this period of conflict, then you can't really do better than a Mexican REIT or Fibra, as they say.
I have two cents to add, Damien. I think maybe the Iran conflict is one, and I don't see it as far-fetched. The other one is, I think, the ruling of the Supreme Court a few days ago against the emergency powers that Trump had invoked to impose tariffs on the world. It's a very important decision that hasn't been priced in as much, and that will help Mexico importantly, I think, because it curtails the President Trump's ideas of how to use tariffs. And in that sense, Mexico, again, becomes an attractive place for investment for nearshoring reasons. I mean, supply chain reasons haven't gone away. And even though that tariffs might not be imposed in other countries, Mexico is still the place to be when it comes to probably manufacturing something at a lower cost and then shipping it to the north, which is right around the corner. So, and the ruling by the Supreme Court is very, very, very important in bringing certain order again to the international trade system. And I think Fibra Monterrey and many other REITs and the country overall could benefit from that.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And actually, Mexico was paying pretty hefty tariffs on its non-USMCA compliant goods, 25%, following that ruling that they're only going to be paying 10, which is what other countries are going to be paying. So Mexico was actually at a disadvantage on the non-USMCA part. Now it isn't going to be. And then the 10 that everyone else is paying, for the time being at least, Mexico isn't paying on its USMCA compliant goods. So it, from a sort of short-term perspective, as well as that long-term point, it's a big gain. So that probably helped it.
Correct.
So moving on, BBVA probably is the company. BBVA Mexico is probably the company in Mexico, the private sector company, and probably almost certainly any company, because the public sector companies don't make a lot of money anymore, that makes most profit in Mexico. So last year, BBVA Mexico made about $6 billion profit, which is obviously a huge number. And they had an investor day, and the head Osuna, the CEO of Mexico, gave a presentation. It's on their website, and it gives quite a lot of interesting insights into BBVA's business model. I mean, that $6 billion profit is about 32.5% of total banking profit in Mexico. So they're making a third of all profits in Mexico's banking system. Their loan market share is 25.6% and growing. Their deposit market share is 24%. They're number one in credit cards, number one in payroll, number one in mortgages, number one in SMEs, number one in public sector lender, and on it goes. The what their claim is that they've become Mexico's largest fintech, in the sense that they have 27 million digital customers in 2025 from 10 million in 2019, way above anyone else, and that 81% of their customer acquisition is digital. 75% of sales by units are now digital, and that 24 million people don't pay transaction fees, as they transact within BBVA's app ecosystem. So they pay from BBVA to BBVA through the app. There's really no cost to anyone, and it's creating that BBVA ecosystem has turned out to be a huge moat. And I see that, just based on the numbers I just said, 1 in 4 people I'll meet will have a BBVA account, and it's much easier to give them money than to someone who's outside my banking system. And they said something that was highlighted in white paper, which I thought was interesting. They said that although the fintechs or the neobanks have issued lots of credit cards, 6, 7, 8 million cards in the case of Nu, they say that even when a customer of BBVA has a fintech credit card, 99% of the billing remains with BBVA. So basically, almost all the transactions stay with BBVA, because that's where their payroll is paid for the most part, and so that's where it's easier. And as a result of that, fintechs have lots of cards, but many fewer transactions, and therefore very little or no profit in most cases. And the other thing, which we've talked about before, is how their low funding costs which is they're only paying an average of 2.5% yield on their deposits, gives them this huge profit edge, which they can then reinvest in part to improve technology and improve and lower fees to people who use their use their applications. Also, they don't say this very low funding cost is at the expense of long-suffering Mexican depositors who are getting far less than inflation and far less than the CETES rate. And it's also funding massive dividends from Mexico to Spain. So it's a huge competitive advantage, but let's not fool ourselves in thinking that it's a good thing for the country that they're paying these kind of yields. Because obviously it isn't. And the hope that people have, including my hope, is that that eventually, and it's taken much longer than people thought, the fintechs will pressure that yield up. That will lead to better deposits for Mexicans, and also will force the incumbent banks, namely BBVA, among others, to lend more because they'll need to offset that funding edge they get by higher lending, because lending is still very, very, very low in Mexico. It's I think total lending to GDP, according to BBVA, is 34%, which is sort of half to a third in some other Latin American countries. So very interesting presentation. It kind of highlights how well they've managed this monster, how they've managed to transition to a digital operation. They talk a lot about how they're using AI to improve still further allocation of credit and selling and service through AI. But I think it also shows what is a big driver of that profit, which are these low deposits, and what the opportunity is for Mexico and for the fintechs and for many smaller incumbent banks to grab market share if they can create an experience as good as BBVA's and give decent market returns to depositors.
It's an amazing story how that monster has become even a larger monster over the years, Damien. I mean, the monster had another monster to compete with, which basically not disappeared, which was Banamex. They were always fighting for the number one, number two position in different markets. Banamex, for reasons that we've talked about, kind of like lost focus, and BBVA took the ball and ran and scored big. They've done a very good job. I remember that they even criticized them heavily when they changed the name from Bancomer to BBVA. Everybody said that was a big mistake, that how could they? They've lost the trademark that had been very well established in Mexicans' minds. But look, it's not so much about branding or anything, it's about execution. And they've executed well, mainly for their own benefit. And hopefully more competition now. The Banamex as a new owner has probably reignited its officials, its whole business model with the new owner that wants to be as successful as probably as BBVA. Maybe we'll see some of the things that we've been waiting for, with more credit, less profit margins, depositors getting a better return. And the fintechs are the promise out there. They're the growing kids in the kindergarten. Let's see if they can become serious students and then professionals. I hope they will, for the benefit of the banking system in Mexico and for the benefit of consumers. In the end, that's what really matters. And those that need loans, that they can get them, grow their business with them, and so on and so forth.
That's right. I mean, I think what the report makes clear, it's not about how many customers you have, but how much revenue and profit you make from those customers. So Nu went around saying they're a top 5 bank in Mexico, which is obviously not true. They're only top 5 under a very strict measure of number of account holders, but the transactions per customer are tiny compared to BBVA. So what they've been able to do is extract much more profit from each customer than anyone else, and that's why they're the leader that they are. So moving on, Forbes, I don't know if you saw that, they put out their annual list, which always generates interest to see who's up and who's down. As usual, since I've been alive, since I've been living in Mexico, which is getting closer and closer to my overall life span, Carlos Slim was number 1. He had a terrific year. He went from 82 billion to 125 billion. And American Mobile did well. The other stocks in his portfolio did did well. The big impressive increase was Germán Larrea, went from 28 to 67, which is amazing, even more than the increase in Grupo Mexico stock price. And then even more spectacular were Alejandro Bayeres from Peñoles, the silver company. He went from 8 billion to 19 billion. The richest woman, again, is María Asunción Aronsuporizabala, but was only about 9 billion, same as the year before, although up from 6 billion a couple of years ago. Big increase in Fernando Chico that we talked about last week, went from 2.8 to 3.8 billion, helped by Afore performing well again, and presumably his other assets. Ricardo Salinas had a bad year. He's gone all the way down from 13 billion in 2024, which was a sort of inflated number based on a kind of artificial stock price for Electra, to 3.7. And we also saw a rough year for the Beckman family, which own Cuervo. People around the world are drinking less spirits, which means less tequila, and so the stock suffered a bit from that. And there's also, as demand for tequila has fallen a bit, there's been more kind of promotional activity by the competitors, and that obviously hurts margins. And his fortune went down from 4.6 to 2 billion. There are no billionaires under 50 in Mexico. The youngest that I could see was David Peñalosa, the toll road company Pinfra, who inherited the business more or less from his father, but made it massively bigger. Most of the credit goes to him. But in Brazil, you have Savarino. Eduardo Savarino is one of the Facebook co-founders, and he's worth 36 billion, and he's still in his 40s, I think. There are only 3 women: Maria Sun, Cynthia Grossman, that's the Arca Contel fortune, and then one of the Beckman family members. And you see a big exposure to mining, as I mentioned, telco, infrastructure, and consumer. Now, the Forbes list is, in my opinion at least, by far from being the kind of Bible. I mean, even just quickly looking at it, you can see mistakes. Like, for example, all of the Larrea family is put into Germán Larrea's fortune, the 67 billion, but he has a sister. One of them is married to Juan Gallardo, and another sister-in-law inherited from his late brother. So, not saying they have it in equal parts, but you should bring down his fortune, and the money's separate. And you could say, well, maybe you want to put all families together, but then then the Koppel family is all separate individually, or almost all separate. So there's a sort of inconsistency on how they treat families. There's a lot of numbers that, I mean, I haven't done the detailed analysis, but kind of surprised that the Garza Lagueras, who control FEMSA, are not there, because FEMSA's worth $40 billion, roughly speaking. And I'm pretty confident that I don't think there's public data on it, but I'm pretty confident that their economic ownership is, at least 20%, which would give them, between the 5 sisters, 8 billion. You've got some private money that's not really, been very well analyzed. There was a big transaction in Monterrey when GE, Vernova, the new electricity business of GE, bought from Signux, and the Garza family, got just for that sale, got 5 billion. Another Garza family got $5 billion for that. So they probably should be there. So there's quite a lot of kind of missing numbers. And then your old shop, Bloomberg, has its own list of billionaires, and they update it it's basically a live data set. Yeah, but it's smaller. It's not just, it's the top 500. So these days that means you have to have a lot more than $1 billion to make the top 500. You see quite significant differences between Bloomberg and Forbes. So Bloomberg has Ricardo Salinas at 7.6 billion. Forbes, obviously, as I said, has him at 3.7. Forbes has Carlos Slim at 125. Bloomberg has Carlos Slim at 112. Forbes has him at 19. Bloomberg at 13. So there's quite a lot of subjective decisions being taken. And it's very difficult to know how much these people are worth, not only because you don't have full disclosure on their assets if they're privately owned, but also a lot of these billionaires have a lot of leverage against their publicly listed assets. So they borrow against their public assets. They can get a very good interest rate to invest in private assets or to build up their stake in their public assets. And often you don't know, if they don't cooperate, what that leverage is. So a lot of these players are a lot more leveraged than you might think. And my guess is that Forbes doesn't have full disclosure. But anyway, a lot of people say how many billionaires Mexico has, which 24 is a big number, don't get me wrong. But actually, according to the Forbes list, Mexico is 19th in the world in billionaires. Used to be much higher. And probably its economy is about the 12th largest economy. So actually we're, contrary to what many people think, we're underperforming on the billionaire index. And I think that's and I think that's partly because tech has become such a huge sector in generating wealth, and Mexico has no tech billionaires, I can see. And places like India and Korea and have and even Brazil have lots of them. So our old economy focus has meant that we've been kind of lagging, and I'm sure that's going to disappoint lots of Mexicans that we're lagging in the billionaire index.
Another one. We're at the bottom of the list. I don't know if you know this, Damien, but in my previous life, I used to help Forbes do their list here in Mexico. So I know some of the answers to your questions. And you're totally right. Not all of the billionaires are there. Like you said, the FEMSA people should be there, but it's really hard to know how much the family owns. And we went over it because according to Mexican securities law, you have to disclose if you own more than 5% of a company, but they do it through combination of CPOs, and so it was really, really difficult. And there's a trust that holds the shares from the certain family plus other family. So you're right. There probably are more billionaires in Mexico. No, I'm not saying there probably. There are more billionaires in Mexico that are not in Forbes list, and I'm not talking about drug traffickers. I'm talking about legal enterprises that are very, very well. I mean, they have great valuations, but they're not there because they're not public, and we cannot know how much they own. The other thing is that on whether Mexico is at the bottom or the middle or the high end of the list. Remember that López Obrador used to say that neoliberalism created the billionaire class because he went from 1 or 2 to 24 or 25 in 1 year. And the reason for that was because Joe Millman, who probably was a reporter for Forbes, came to Mexico and digged in a little bit deeper, found how much the families own in stock prices in companies that were trading in the stock market, and made the calculation. So it wasn't that the disparity of wealth was taken over by neoliberalism. It's just that somebody did its job properly and found out that many Mexicans were worth more than $1 billion. And that's how the increase in numbers came about. It doesn't mean that I'm not trying to say that there is not wealth disparity issues in Mexico. That's another topic, but it has nothing to do with how many Mexicans there are or not in the billionaires list, either or Forbes, Bloomberg, or any other company that tallies the fortunes of these people. And like you said, it's an estimated guess. At best, it might be underestimated in many cases. The leverage is not taking into account. Some include dividends, some don't. Some include artwork, some don't. Properties. So there are a lot of variables that make the numbers and a very guess estimate of how much people are wealth, how much their wealth is here and everywhere. I'm not just saying that the problem pertains only to Mexican billionaires, but I guess it's true to every other individual.
I was going to say, Eduardo, before your intervention, that no doubt Forbes outsourced the work to some 21-year-old intern, but now I realize you did it. I'm very, very great, very fortunate that I didn't say that.
I
They had
did
the
it
most.
in 2000 and started in 2007. I wasn't 21 years old, but I wasn't as old as I am now. And they were very thorough, I gotta say. First, I did it by myself. Then they saw what I did for Sentido Común, my old shop, and then I even sent them my estimates to try to convince them that they were wrong, and then they tapped me to help them out.
So shall we move on to our last subject before we get to the interview with Guillermo from Amafore? It was a great story in White Paper on foreign investment in Mexican football teams. And basically, according to the article, there's something like $500 million of accumulated foreign investment tied to Liga MX. Obviously, the latest one, which we've talked about, was General Atlantic's deal for 49% of Club America through the newly created Grupo Águilas, which, apart from Club America, also includes Estadio Banorte and some real estate near the Estadio Banorte. Most people will still know it as Estadio Azteca. And GA paid 240. It's an estimate of 240 million for the 49% stake. And there's some other ones. You've got Querétaro. There was an investment by Mark Spiegel, and apparently that's the first sort of majority-owned U.S. club in Liga MX. Nexcaca, Sam Porter and Antilles. They bought about 50% of the club, and there you have people like Eva Longoria, Ryan Reynolds involved as well. Atlético de San Luis, which is owned by Atlético de Madrid, which has now just been bought by Apollo, I think for like $2.5 billion or so. So you're seeing that, and what the article says is basically you're buying these clubs at a much lower price tag than U.S. clubs. So the average MLS club valuation is about $730 million. Into Miami is valued at $1.3 billion. Whereas, as we just heard, Club America may be valued at under $500 million. You've got more eyeballs in typically in Mexico. Still not successful at sort of monetizing those eyeballs, but maybe that will come with time. You've got increasing kind of cross-border U.S.-Mexico competitions, and so it's basically you're getting into clubs at a lower valuation with big fan base, a lot of opportunity to monetize more effectively.
They did a great job, Damien. I like the story too because they did wrap up all the investments that have taken place over the past few years and gave us a good sense of how this has happened, the numbers, and obviously the last element that you just pointed out, that I think these investors or these equity firms are seeing value in the sports or the companies that own the teams because they are cheap versus what they could be worth if you compare them to America. Obviously, purchasing power of Mexico is far lower than the one in the U.S., and that probably explains why the valuations here haven't reached the levels that they've reached in the States, since soccer or football is much more the national sport here than in America. But nevertheless, I think these people see great value proposition for the future in the next few years, and it'll be interesting to see how it all evolves and how they take their assets and make them more profitable, as they, I'm sure, are thinking that they can and that they will, due to the eyeballs that football generates here versus America, and even the fact that Mexicans might not have as much purchasing power as Americans. You have many more here. So it's going to be an interesting evolution for the industry, for the teams, for the players even. Maybe even at some point the female football league also grabs attention. I think it's great that We're seeing a lot of movement in a league that needed a little bit of a shakedown. It was a Toby's boy club, and now it's more professional, I think, with people really looking to making money out of their teams. I think even Azcárraga himself, who was always very much involved in the America team, the fact that he is now heading the company that is separated from Televisa with all these new assets, I think he seems to be his passion seems to be this new entity, and within it, the football and the money that it can generate.
That's right. And to give credit where it's due, the article was written by El Mister in White Paper. El Mister has effectively a joint venture with White Paper. El Mister is a sports business platform and newsletter covering the economics of sports, and they have a weekly piece in White Paper that goes into some depth on an issue of the week about sports and the business of sports in Mexico. Strongly recommend it. Terrific. Well, I think that's it for now. So why don't we head to Guillermo for our talk on the Mexican pension fund industry?
Let's do that. It's an honor to introduce Guillermo Zamarripa, president of the Asociación Mexicana de Administradoras de Fondos para el Retiro, or basically the Association of Private Pension Fund Companies in Mexico, better known as Amafore. Guillermo has had a broad experience both in the public and private sector. So, Guillermo, thanks for spending some time with us today.
It is my pleasure to be in the podcast with you, Eduardo and I.
Thank you. Let's start. Give us a size of the Amafore capacity that it has today. I mean, pensions in Mexico have been growing thanks to some legal reforms that were implemented many years back, decades, and now they represent a huge amount of resources that could be put to good use.
That is right. The system as it is today started in 1997. That's 29 years will be this July, all the system. It started as a defined contribution system, but I think the real purpose of the system in the Cedillo administration was to separate the funds for paying pensions in the future in individual accounts so that the government would not put their hands on that money as it happened before. The situation of Instituto Mexicano de Seguro Social back in 1995 was that basically they did not have money and they spent all the pension money in building the infrastructure, the hospital infrastructure of the Seguro Social. Partly was funded by the pension money and part with the Social Security contribution. So that was very, very important to have that money really isolated and to build up an internal base of savings for the economy. That was a second purpose of the Cedillo administration. I don't know if you remember well the tequila crisis back in 94. One of the problems was that the government debt was short-term, basically in pesos, some denominated in dollars, but payable in pesos. So we had that problem, and one of the reasons of the vulnerability of the Mexican economy was that Mexico did not have a long-term savings structure in the economy. So those were like the two basic ideas in mind of that project. What happens with good public policies is that if you let them in time develop and get to the place where you expected them to be 3 decades before, you get the reality. And that's what we're seeing in the pension system. And I think in another public policy that was very relevant from the mid-90s, that is NAFTA, now USMCA. I think those two pieces of public policy of the 90s really transformed the Mexican economy. One has made Mexico the largest trading partner with the U.S., after basically more than 30 years. And the part of the Afore system, you have now savings for accumulated more than 400 US billion dollars. That's around 24% of GDP in savings. That amount is expected to grow in the next 5 or 6 years to get to between $800 billion and $900 billion. So that will be a very important amount of internal savings of the workers long term, and that 800 to 900 billion dollars maybe will be around 40% of the Mexican economy. So that's more or less the evolution of the system, where we're now and where we expect to be within the next 6 years. And those savings are invested mainly in Mexico.
That's a huge amount of resources. Before I go into, can you help the Mexico plan or the Plan Mexico fund itself with some of these resources, or is that one of the aims? I'm worried about, with that size of resources, are they secure of not intervention by the authorities?
Well, let me, of the more than 400 billion US dollars that we have under management today, let me tell you briefly about the structure of the system portfolio. It varies a lot among the Afores, and within the Afores among the target date funds of each Afore. But if you say the whole resources is a single institutional investors, what you would see is around 50% of Mexico government bonds. That's 50%, mainly bonds, or not CEDES, but the long-term bonds, either fixed nominal rate in pesos bond, or the ones that are fixed real-term rate bonds, the ones that are indexed to inflation. So that's 50%. Then you have around 20% in directly invested in equities. Of that 20%, I would say 1/3 is in the local equity market in Mexican shares, and 2/3 are invested abroad. And within that investment abroad, I would say that the largest share is US markets, and then comes Japan and some European markets, but we are really exposed in terms of equity investment to the US market. And then you have the residual 30%. Of that 30%, I would say that 12-13% is Mexican corporates, and then you have a residual of 14-15%, and there you have alternative investments, fibras, and other kind of assets. What we see is that the portfolio is diversified, and maybe what we will see in the next years is a shift of the portfolio, less in Mexican government securities and maybe more in the other asset classes. And within the other asset classes, we believe that alternative investments is a relevant asset class that will grow in size within the next 5 to 10 years. And within that portfolio of alternative investments, one of the sub-asset classes is infrastructure investment, together with private debt and private equity. So that is an asset class that the Afores are willing to invest. And there are basically two reasons. One reason is that when you see data from pension funds around the world, either public or private, you can see public pension funds like the ones in Canada. They have around between 7 and 8% of their assets are invested in infrastructure. When you see the Australian pension funds, that those are more like private funds, you see also around 8% of their assets invested in infrastructure. The Australians have, for infrastructure investment, what they did, I don't know, I don't remember if it was like 15 or 20 years ago, or maybe even more. They had certain assets within the government control, and they needed a lot of infrastructure investment. So what they did was a very smart program that they say, let's take those assets, let's put them in an investment vehicle, and let's sell that investment vehicle to the pension funds. And with that money, I get those resources and I spend in new infrastructure that Australia needs desperately. So they kind of recycled their mature infrastructure projects, and they've done that like 2 or 3 times. So it's a very, very successful program. So you have Australian pension funds with 8% of their assets in infrastructure. And then you have pension funds, mainly government funds in Europe that invest also a lot of infrastructure. So pension funds usually invest in infrastructure. So why not Afore should invest in infrastructure if pension funds around the world do that? So that's one reason. And the second reason is why. Basically, infrastructure investments are very long term. That's our investment horizon. You can have reasonable certainty of the cash flows of the project. If it is a brownfield project, it's not like very volatile in terms of the business cycles. It's kind of stable. The use for the demand for electricity or the use of the toll roads and other kind of infrastructure. So it's an asset that gives kind of a stability to the whole portfolio of the pension funds. It's an asset that is not very volatile, so you can invest in equities, and this helps with the government bonds to kind of stabilize the returns of the portfolio. So it's an asset class that makes sense for the pension funds. So that's why we're interested. And regarding the Plan Mexico, I would say 2 things. The first one is the Afores today invest in infrastructure. Part of their portfolio is invested in infrastructure projects, either electricity, toll roads, and water, and some other infrastructure projects. So now we participate in those kind of investments. Looking forward for what will be the deployment of the investments related to the Plan Mexico, our view is very simple. The projects that we will be interested in investing are projects that are well defined with a reasonable demand behind, that you can have cash flows in the future, and it has a reasonable rate of return. And projects that typically comply with these economic characteristics are basically electricity, toll roads, and last week, the president in one of their morning conferences, she made a presentation. And then Hacienda made another presentation, and they had this interesting graph where the government say 54% of the infrastructure investment from 2026 to 2030 will be in electricity projects. That's a common ground between the plan of the government and one kind of infrastructure investment that we do like, electricity. And then the second one, in terms of share, was trains. That trains we are not. Trains is a very difficult asset, mainly the part of passenger trains. The cash flow is not very well predictable. It's very volatile. But the trains for merchandise transporting, related more to logistics, those are assets that can make sense. And then the third asset class was toll roads, another kind. That's also where we have investments, and we see that as a reasonable project. So if you add electricity plus toll roads, is 2/3 of the program. So within 2/3 of the program, there's a coincidence. So we will be doing that in the next 4 or 5 years for sure. Infrastructure investment in projects related to the Plan Mexico.
I hope some authorities listen to what you're saying so that they can come up with ideas, like you said, probably putting stabilized infrastructure projects in one package so that they can get resources from that and they could invest in greenfields that are not stabilized and then later on recycle the whole thing. I think that's a brilliant idea that you just explained. And before I hand it over to Damien, I just have another question. Are there any restrictions that you would like the government to lift in terms of the possibilities of the Afores investing in different types of assets, or you're happy with the way that it is right now?
I think that we've had in the last 28, almost 29 years of the system, regulators from all political parties and spectrum. But started with PRI, then PAN, then PRI again, and now Morena. What we've seen for regulators heading concern, it's always a view of how they change the rules in order to make the system evolve in a reasonable way. Originally, the system had only one fund, and the requirement was to invest 90% in government bonds. That's back in 97. Then we migrated to several funds and then to the life cycle funds, and now we have the target date funds that is very consistent with the operational model that you see in the pension fund industry in the US. Most of the pension funds that are in the 401ks and all the other private pension plans in the US, when they invest in mutual funds, they use target date funds. So we evolved from one mutual fund to a very modern operating structure. And within that evolution, the investment regime was very restrictive in the sense that only government bonds, and then they say, well, private corporate bonds, and then they started with shares, and then they started with this, and then with alternative assets but only local, and then they started with shares, foreign shares, and then they say, well, also alternative assets abroad. And what we've seen in the evolution of the investment regime in these almost 3 decades is opening the system. But I think that all the regulators did it in a very responsible way, saying the system is evolving, we need to have new asset classes, and they say, well, we don't have the human capital infrastructure within the Afores, and let's open a very small door. And then they started to open that door. And that's what happened, for example, in alternative assets. When they allow investment in alternative assets, they say it's only in Mexico and a very small portion of the portfolio. The limit was quite restrictive. And then they say, well, let's open it a little bit more. And then they say, well, it's reasonable to invest in foreign alternative assets. And that was after the SERPI was created in the securities market law in 2015. And the last change was last year that they say for the CFOs of the youngest generations, they increased the limit from 20 to 30%. So this gradual approach of opening the investment regime, I think what is the correct approach. And today we don't see a huge restriction. If you see what's going on the markets, in the global markets and the asset classes, I think the only one that we cannot invest is crypto. Besides crypto, I think today the Afores can invest in almost everything, in commodities, in a lot. So really we have a reasonable regulation, a very reasonable regulation, and the regulation is evolving. And that's the most important thing, that the regulation does not stay like fixed and without change, and that will impose a restriction. So that's how we see the regulation regarding the investment regime. And certainly in the next 3 or 4 years, there will be changes. and we will have a different set of rules than the ones that we have today, but the idea will be to allow the Afores to invest in other asset classes and have the adequate mix in terms of risk and return.
Guillermo, I think there were some recent changes that require the Afores, when they invest in international private equity, to invest a higher amount in local foreign equity and Mexican foreign equity at the same time. What was the reasoning behind those changes, if you confirm them, and do you think they were a good idea?
Let me tell you what the logic of those changes, because I think it's very interesting to understand what happened and how we feel about that. We had a 20% limit for alternative assets. That was the limit. And a lot of the investment in alternative assets today is made through the SERPs of the Afores. And those SERPs have certain rules. Depending on what you put on the SERP, it is considered a local investment or a foreign investment. And those rules made you have SERPs with foreign investment that were local securities. What CONSAR did was, and then you had also the first investment in alternative assets were only in Mexico, because that was a restriction. So you had within the portfolio of the Afores, I would say the first generation investment in alternative assets only local, and then you had the SERPs with a mix local and foreign investment. And then what CONSAR said is the following: I will increase you the limit from 20 to 30, but in this additional amount that you can invest, it has to go, I think it's 80% to Mexico. So we have now a biggest bucket, I would say, that's divided in two parts. And we have some Mexico legacy assets that the new assets in Mexico will go to part A of the bucket, and then the international diversification will be in part B of the bucket. So if you say overall, we have more capacity to invest in alternative assets abroad and in Mexico. So if there are good projects in Mexico related to the Plan Mexico, we will be putting a lot of assets in the bucket A of the 30%, and then we will have the bucket B for other kind of investments. So I think that the change was good in the sense that it really imposes a restriction, but because of the increase of the size of the bucket, the restriction is not really so huge. What the government is really saying is, I'm going to increase the overall limit, but I don't want all the money to go abroad. I want part of that money to stay here. So I think it's a fair statement of the government to say part of the alternative asset investment has to be made in Mexico. I think that's fair. And the way they did it, they do not do some kind of crowding out of the actual structure of the portfolio. That's why I think it's good.
I guess it does underline the sort of the tension in the Afore system between, on the one hand, maximizing returns so people get good pensions, and on the other hand, fulfilling the government's development goals, like more money going to private equity in Mexico, more money going into infrastructure in Mexico. I mean, obviously what we want is those things to always be aligned, but in the real world, you can see some trade-offs between these objectives. I understand that legally and from a fiduciary perspective, returns have to be the priority of an Afore manager, but the government has clearly got other issues that it also cares about, because their utility function is political popularity at the end of the day. So kind of related to that, I mean, before the election in 2024, the Morena, the party, had a policy document, and they probably had several. And one of them, which I'm sure you read at the time, sort of said, and we should nationalize the Afore money and use it to give a general pension to all Mexicans, because only about, as I understand it, about 50% of Mexicans don't benefit from the Afores because they're informal. They don't have any contributions to the Afores. And then I guess, although they didn't say this so explicitly because it wasn't as politically popular, their other motive was, for the government to get cheap financing. Question is, were you nervous when you saw these policy platforms that Mexico would do what they did in Argentina some years back and take over the Afores and use that money to finance a universal pension? And the second question is, given that 50% or so of Mexican workers are informal, do we need a more profound reform of the pension system in order for every Mexican worker to benefit from a pension system?
Let me start, because I think I know what document you are talking about, Damien. It's a document that prepares some people of Morena, not only in the pension topic, but in several pensions, they have particular views. And during the campaign, actually, people from the campaign, they say that's not the official document of the campaign. The official document of the campaign is a document that they published, I think was around February of 2024, and was 100 ideas about governing Mexico. And in that document, they don't say what you are talking about. It's in the other document. So that was related to Morena and some people in the party, but was not the official political platform of the then candidate, now president. So there has not been a conversation with their team about those ideas. But let me go to the structure of the pension system today. I think President López Obrador had it very, very clear what he had to do, because I think he understood very well that the Mexican economy, it's a very particular economy. It's one of the biggest economies around the world. I don't know if it is 12, 13, 11, 14, because it depends on which statistics you check and the exchange rate at the moment. But we are, maybe, let's put it the 12th economy, but within that, it's a large economy. Also, it's a large population, 130 million, but it's a population, large informal sector. It has been around 52 and 55% in the last 25 or 30 years. I would say, 30 years. Some time ago, I made a number and tried to figure out what was the mix of total workers, of the informal workers among the total workers of the economy when NAFTA started. That was 92, 93. And the mix is around the same today. So it has been fluctuating from 54 to 56, 57%. Sometimes you get more formal employment and the informality gets down to 52. Then bad things happen and it goes to 55, 56. What happened last year in the Mexican economy, if you see the data from INEGI, you had a job creation of around 1 million workers, 1.1 million workers. The official data of IMSS is creation of formal workers around 250,000. And if you say that you have maybe 50, 60 or 80,000 people working in new jobs in local governments, state governments, municipalities, etc., you have around 750,000 new informal workers in 2025, and you had an increase from I think was around 53.5 to 54.5. So, but we're in that range, and it fluctuates and depends on how the economy is doing. So the intuition of the president, and with it, those informal workers, you have two types of workers, and that's very important. You have type A, is the informal worker that is always informal. And then you have type B, the informal worker that sometimes is formal and sometimes is informal and sometimes is not working. So there's a big problem with type A. And what the president said is, let's put in the Constitution this right to the universal pension. So you provide a safety net for all these type A people that they will get a pension when they reach 65. And then what he said is, let's have the Afore system on top of this. So people that work in the formal sector for a certain time, maybe 10 years in the formal sector, they will have some money saved. So their safety net will be the universal pension plus some savings. And then you have people that work more in the formal sector, and those people that work more in the formal sector that will get to in 2030 to 1,000 weeks in the formal sector, that's around 19, 20 years. They will have, when they finish their formal market career, they can go to Seguro Social and say, I have this amount saved, and the government will say, you have a guarantee. And if this money is less than the guarantee, I take the money and I pay you the guarantee, so you have an extra income. If the savings is more than the guaranteed pension, you'll keep your savings and you are fine with that. So they are providing also for the formal worker like an additional safety net that is a small complement of the pension. So what the previous administration did was the following. The system in 97 was a system only for government, for formal workers, and basically no government warranty. The government warranty was of today's pesos around 3,500 pesos, very, very low. And basically nobody was going to use the warranty because the ones that had the 1,250 weeks were the workers with higher income, that if you made like 20,000 pesos, really the warranty of 3,500 pesos doesn't make sense. It's a 15%. So you get more with your savings. So basically what Cedillo's government did was to create a pension system that basically had no risk for the government, no payout of the government required, all the risk for the workers. And what López Obrador said was, let's put a safety net for all the informal workers, let reduce the amount of weeks, let's increase the guarantee, and let's also increase the contribution from 6.5 to 15%, because if you put a little money, you will get a little money when you get your pension. If you put more money, you will get more money as a pension. So really what he did was a system that has components, I would say, that you have A plus B plus C, and whether an individual gets only A or A plus B or A plus B plus C, some will be better off. So that's what they did, and that's why the discussion in the public opinion about the pension system, I think today is different. Nobody really criticizes the universal pension because it's the safety net. And then the people that have their savings, they are starting to say that money is mine. No? So that's a big evolution, I think. And our view is that what we need to do in Mexico is really create this awareness that income when you retire is not only one source of income. It's different sources of income that complement each other. And if you want to have a better pension, you need to add components. That's the challenge that we have in terms of communication trends. We need to create awareness about this idea of the multiple pillars or sources of income in old age in Mexico.
That's very clear. Actually, I haven't heard someone explain it so clearly to me, and I follow the subject quite closely. So thank you for that. My last question, Guillermo, and it might be a difficult question because you obviously represent the Afores, but my friends in the financial sector often complain that there are five guys that control, usually they're guys, there are five guys that control 25% of GDP in Mexico, and all you need to do is be friends or went to school with one of those five guys, and you can get your private equity fund or your IPO or your bond sorted out. And if you didn't go to school with them or not friends with them or don't have that trust, it's a challenge. Do you think the system is overly concentrated, and do you think it's difficult and it would be beneficial to have a bit more competition and a bit easier access for people outside the circle of knowledge?
That's a very good question and tough. Let me start by saying one thing that is a stylized fact about the Mexican economy. The Mexican economy in general terms is concentrated. We have 2 TVs and now 1 or 2 for sports. So we have 4 players in the TV market. And then in beers, we have also very limited number of players. And if you go to beer and if you go to Mexico, as all the smaller economies, with the exception, I think, of the US and China, have a limited number of participants in certain key industries. So that happens in Germany and in Canada and in Spain so we have to live with that. The US is, the Mexican economy is around 7% of the US economy. So if you have an economy that is 15 times larger, you have a lot more players. So that's one thing that we need to consider. And my view is that 10 players for the pension fund industry is okay. It's not, maybe 15 would be better, have more competition, but 10 is not bad. In terms of you need to go to school with somebody that, I think maybe at some stage of the system, when it was a lot smaller, maybe that happened in some cases. But I think that CONSAR was very aware that you need to create good corporate governance in terms of investment decisions. And now most of the investment decisions, you have to go to committees and there's this evaluation procedure of the investments and all of that. So you cannot say that it's 100% bulletproof, but you have good governance processes and regulation that try to decrease the risk of what you said happening, of not complying with your fiduciary duty. I think also part because of regulation, part because of the sophistication of the management teams today of the Afores, you really, within the 10 players in the industry, I would say that they have a culture that part of their, in the role, they have a fiduciary duty to look for the best investments and really to avoid investments that will end up in a loss. Not that you make a bad investment, because anybody that makes an investment can make a bad investment, but whether when you know that you made a bad investment, there are a lot of controls to avoid that. And related to the conversation about the Plan Mexico, I think that's one thing that worries a lot of the people in the industry, how to have a good evaluation procedure in order to only select good investments and avoid bad investments. So that's within, I would say, the culture of the industry. And yes, today you have 10 CEOs of the Afores and 10 CIOs of one of each Afore, that they control roughly 25% of GDP of Mexico. But I think that's part of the structure of the economy. And I would say that as of today, if you take the assets of the banking system and the 10 largest banks, the CEOs of the banks control a largest share of GDP than the pension funds. So we have another industry that is a lot larger, and that the same argument applies. And this leads me to a thing that I believe is very important for the Mexican financial industry. We mentioned earlier in the conversation about the tequila crisis in 94. The financial system of Mexico in 94 was basically a bank-based financial system. You had the brokerage houses, the insurance companies were a lot smaller. Today we have a financial system after 3 decades that if you adopt the portfolio of the Afores plus the mutual funds plus the insurance companies, the institutional investors in size are larger than the banks. So we have a financial industry with a lot of players that's more diversified, and you have different sources of investment. And within this, you can say, well, insurance company, they basically finance the government. Yes, that's true, but you have 4 big industries playing within the financial system, and I think that makes a system that is more robust than the one that we had 30 years ago. And maybe we'll have like, I don't know, 25 guys and girls controlling 75% of GDP in their institutions within the next 10 years. It's still a very small group.
Understood. I mean, you and this isn't a question, more of an observation, and then I'll hand over to Eduardo. But you talk about 10 Afores, but I think there's 4 that, 21 Banorte, Profuturo, Sura, Banamex, that have about 70% of the market. So when people say 4 or 5, and if you add Pensionista, maybe you get to top 5, have 75% of the assets under management. So there's a sort of sense that it's a bit more cartelized than the 10 number that you give. And then I think most of the complaints I get is actually there's too much kind of groupthink in the Afores. They follow each other. They don't take risk, don't take enough risk. They don't think out of the box. But anyway, I'll leave it there. We can have hopefully you'll come back onto the podcast and answer those kind of questions, which are not really up to you to answer when it comes to individual Afores. Anyway, Eduardo, over to you. Thank you so much, Guillermo.
Oh, you're very welcome, Dickman.
Guillermo, the first pensioners are coming to extract their funds from the Afores as we are speaking. Have you done any research of how are the Afores clients perceiving their pensions? Do they feel like stakeholders in the system? I think if it's the case, that's very good for the system. That workers feel that the pensions will be there when they need them. I think that will probably encourage people to try to find a formal job rather than be in the informal economy. What's your sense on that end?
I think we need to divide the population in different segments. Today we have a segment of people retiring that they will get their benefits according to the previous law, the 73 law. They have their money in the Afore. So that a very good decision at the time was, I don't care if you are in the 73 regime or the 97 regime, all the money goes to the individual account. So now when an individual of the past system goes to IMSS and say, I'm going to retire, I'm 63, let me make my calculation, okay, and say, you have 400 weeks. You are not eligible for pension. But I'll give you this paper that says that you are not eligible for the pension, and you go to the Afore and you claim your money. So those people are really happy because before they didn't have any money and now they have some money. And then you have a group of those that say, okay, you have 1,000 weeks or 900 weeks because the minimum is 500, you are eligible for a pension. So let's make your calculation. This is the pension that the government will pay. And then they say, of the amount of money that you have, you will take A and B, and C, D, and E, the government gets that money and will be used to pay your pension. And if I finish that money and you're still alive, I will pay you your pension. So those people are really happy because they also get some cash and they get a good pay from the government. And then you have people retiring or starting to retire with the new rules. And there you have also two groups of people. The first group of people is the same as the first group of people in the late 73. The ones that do not comply with the minimum wage, but they have money and they will get that money back and use it for the pension. So they will have an extra money to live besides the universal pension that the government gives. So that creates this A plus B. And then you have the people that complies with the minimum number of weeks, and they say you are eligible. This is the minimum that you have because López Obrador raised the minimum pensions. You will get more money, more pension with your money, you take your money, or your money is not enough for the guarantee. I take bucket C, D, and E, and I give you the guaranteed pension similar to the prior systems. And what we've seen of the people retiring, you have a lot of people not complying with the number of weeks that they are getting their extra money. And of the people complying with the weeks, what we're seeing is that more than 90%, they take the guarantee. But there's a reason for that. And I'm going to make you a very brief example with the calculation. When Cedillo made the system, they basically adopted the same rules for contribution of the old system and the new system. 6.5% of your salary. If you work for 1 year and you contribute every month 6.5% of your salary, within a year of full formal work, you have only less than 80% of 1 month of salary. With that amount of contribution, even though you work for 4 years, you will get only 32 months of savings, plus interest and returns and all of that. But it's very little money. If you put in little money, you get out little money. And López Obrador was the one that said, I have to increase the contribution. At 15%, if you work for a full year, you will get basically 2 months of salary. Then after 40 years of work, that's basically 6 years of savings of contributions plus returns. You can have replacement rates around 70% that are very reasonable. So what López Obrador did was, I know that a lot of people for a lot of years put in little money. Let's make the guarantee, let's fix it at a level that it's reasonable. And the omission of not increasing the rate of contribution before, the government is going to pay you for that. So he really aligned the incentives of the system. So what you see is most of the people having the warranty and they are getting a replacement rate around 75%. Plus the universal, plus this, they are getting reasonable pensions. But
Guillermo,
those people
this is
are
fascinating.
Very, very few.
Well, thanks so much, Guillermo. This is fascinating. We could keep on talking about the system, how it's working, how it could be working future, whether it's concentrated or not. I thought you brought out a lot of issues that I hadn't heard and that were very well explained. So on my behalf, and I think on Damien's behalf, thank you for your time. And we have to have you back in the podcast later on.
Oh, thank you very much, Eduardo and I. Thank you very much, Damien, for the invitation. And I hope the ideas that I shared with you were interesting and somehow different from the typical interview about pensions in Mexico.
Thank you for joining Mex Moves, our weekly podcast on Mexico business and finance. I very much hope you tune in next week.